The strategic influence it's a name that I've given to there's two types of podcasts. And we've already mentioned a couple of them. Like Joe Rogan is a very particular type of podcast. And so the way I've separated podcasts is you have media podcasts on one side and you have what I call strategic influence podcasts on the other. So the media podcasts are the ones that, like, when someone thinks podcast in their head, it is the type of podcast that is the media podcast, because those are the big names, right? Your Joe Rogans, your Daily Wires, your Steven Crowders, and Fox News Business. Those are all in like the political space. But there's a lot of the podcasts where the podcast exists as a business unto itself, right? Where you have staff and you have the content creation, and all of that is designed to create an audience, and then with that audience sell advertising to pay for itself. So it's a business model where the podcast is the business. Welcome to PBP.FM, brought to you by Push Button Podcasts, your go-to resource for grabbing attention, building awareness, and creating authority in your marketplace. I'm Richard Matthews, your host and guide through the wonderful world of podcasting as a driver of business. Here, we teach how to use a multimedia podcast as the cornerstone of your omnipresent content marketing strategy. Whether you're an entrepreneur, podcaster, expert, or thought leader, you'll discover creative ways to leverage your digital content. From blogs to video, from YouTube to TikTok, and everything in between. I'll show you how to stand out from the noise so you can directly connect with potential customers, build strategic partnerships, and drive leads into your business. Get ready for actionable tips and tangible takeaways on improving your digital presence across the board. With that, let's dive into this week's episode of PBP.FM. Hello and welcome back to the PBP.FM podcast. My name is Richard Matthews. I am the founder of Push Button Podcasts, and I've got on the line with me today my co-host Kevin Rundle. Kevin, are you there?
I'm here. How are you today, Richard?
I'm doing really well. Despite some family circumstances, we lost our family dog yesterday, which sucks. But other than that, life is going good. Can't complain. What I wanted to get into and talk about today, though, is we're going to talk a little bit about strategic influence podcasts and how you can generate awareness, grab attention, build authority with them. Sound like a good topic conversation for us?
Sounds perfect. Sounds like exactly the kind of stuff we talk about far too often.
Yeah, especially when you're working around me, and that's what our whole company is about, is helping people do that. So what I want to start off with is what actually a strategic influence podcast is, because I know there's a bunch of words in there. We strung them together and intentionally. It's not something everyone else knows. We get to define it. So I want to take a few minutes and define that with you and just talk about it. I think let's start with podcast and how the word podcast has evolved over the last couple of years. What have you seen?
So I would just say in the last couple of years, I quit thinking of podcasts as just an audio thing that you listen to in your car when you go for a run. I tend to consume a lot of mine more as video podcasts via YouTube or via those types of technologies. I presume you do also, based on the way Push Button Podcast came together. So like I've got some favorites that sometimes the video is just so important to the message. And I've got some that are just great for, like I said, listening to in a car when I just want to hear somebody else's thoughts on a subject that I'm interested in.
Yeah,
So
it's interesting because the term podcast, if you go back 4 or 5 years ago, it was like audio show, like episodic audio show. And you subscribe to them on iTunes, or maybe you subscribe to them on Spotify. Probably, I say 4 or 5 years ago, but it was like the last presidential election, which was 2016 or so. There was like a really big shift in just how the term podcasting has been used culturally. And now it's expanded to include almost any sort of episodic content, whether that's on YouTube or if it's video stuff on Spotify, like Joe Rogan's show, or with the advent of things that came and went, like Twitter's Periscope with the live video stuff. And it's just any sort of alternative media is starting to be used. The coin, the term podcast is been put on top of those. Have you seen the same thing?
yeah, so I think as soon as Joe Rogan got big, when he signed his Spotify deal and people started to really pay attention to it, he used the term podcast on some level, I think, or somebody used it to describe what he does, probably because a lot of people did consume it as just audio. And at that moment, anything with video started to be included in that topic from my perspective. I think right around, that's got to be about the time when I started thinking of everything as a podcast instead of just the audio portion.
Today, the term that we use at Push Button Podcasts, what we're referring to for podcasts is regularly created multimedia content that's being put into the marketplace. That is really where the term podcast sits now. It'll probably continue to evolve as technology evolves, but today it's episodic multimedia content.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that nails it also
So,
because that's how I think of it also. If not episodic, at least, yeah, episodic. No, that's the best word for it.
yeah.
Like when I think about what I watch typically and think of as a podcast, I don't know that I always think of it as episodic because the topic can vary significantly, just Joe Rogan's show, but it is episodic in that I'm waiting for the next session or whatever.
The next hit, right? The next hit of that show, whatever it is. But yeah, it's episodic. It doesn't necessarily have to be, I think the other term would be serial, right? Like serialized fiction. So one,
Yeah, serialized is the word I would think about it
yeah.
too.
So they can be serialized, right? We'll do series like that on this show. We'll have like our series on the 10 Commandments of podcasting, which is serialized, but the actual release of the content is episodic. Every week something comes out and we move things forward with it. So that's where we wanted to start, is just what do we mean by podcast? The second question is, what is strategic influence?
So yes, episodic serial content. Do you want to talk about that again for a few seconds? They have some place to go back to.
I think we should just move on to strategic influence. So the next part of
Perfect.
that. So if podcast is your episodic content, then what is strategic influence? And strategic influence is, it's a name that I've given to, there's two types of podcasts. And we've already mentioned a couple of them. Like Joe Rogan is a very particular type of podcast. And so the way I've separated podcasts is you have media podcasts on one side and you have what I call strategic influence podcasts on the other. So the media podcasts are the ones that, like, when someone thinks podcast in their head, it is the type of podcast that is the media podcast, because those are the big names, right? Your Joe Rogans, your Daily Wires, your Steven Crowders, and Fox News Business. Those are all in like the political space. But there's a lot of the podcasts where the podcast exists as a business unto itself, where you have staff and you have the content creation, and all of that is designed to create an audience, and then with that audience sell advertising to pay for itself. So it's a business model where the podcast is the business. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. So I think I tend to think of podcasts as educational or entertainment, and often the educational ones fall somewhere in that category, that strategic category you're talking about for sure, where it is a business unto itself and it exists as both a marketing tool and a tool for advertisement. The entire thing exists, like you said, as a business unto itself.
Yeah.
I think of things like Chris Williamson or Dave Farley, continuous delivery. I listen to his podcast all the time. It's much more educational in nature and again, episodic, and it exists as its own thing, separate from Dave himself, really, or from anything else he's done career wise.
So it's not really like, the podcast is the business, right?
Yeah.
That's when people think podcast, I think that's what they're, a lot of times they're thinking about, is they're thinking the podcast is the business. And if the podcast is the business, then you operate it a certain way and you do certain things with the content, and you have certain metrics that you're tracking, like viewership and subscribers, and the things that you're going to do for marketing on that podcast are all geared towards, we need more subscribers because we're trying to grow our gated content on the other side to make the podcast business viable. When we start talking to clients about push button podcasts, a lot of times they look at us and they're like, I don't see how a or how a podcast like that fits into my business, because it doesn't. It's a separate business. And that's
Right.
where we needed to come up with a term to describe the type of podcast that we talk about, we work with at our company, is this strategic influence podcast. And a strategic influence podcast, the biggest difference is it is the content and the serialized content, everything that you're doing, episodic content, is designed to support an existing business. It's designed to help you create leads, designed to help you create authority, designed to help you to show up and have the awareness and whatnot in your marketplace so you can sell more of your products.
Yeah.
So it's a support wing or a marketing wing of your business.
Yeah, it's designed to deliver awareness. It's designed to really push that omnipresence on some level, give you a place to be a thought leader for sure.
Yeah.
Um, I hate the term leader because I've worked with so many like really big companies as a marketing automation person and as a technical person. And they love these really big lingo words that have no value. I think it's the nature of being in business to like having your own lingo and stuff. But a lot of guys talk about digital experience marketing. And I think podcasting is a part of that digital experience marketing. But I think the term is so ambivalent, really, or so broad that it doesn't really mean anything ever. You can use it anywhere and it doesn't seem out of context. But
Sure.
I think you're right. So, strategic influence podcast, you're making episodic or serial content, And it's just to create some influence and awareness about the things that your business does, or would be my thoughts if that's like
Yeah.
from the push button podcast perspective. I doubt you're going to talk about how to take care of elephants if you're running a real estate business, unless that's really your thing. But they probably
It's
won't match, and it'll become its own business for sure.
it's gonna fit into your world in some way. The strategic influence part, I think, is really about you touched on this a minute ago, is omnipresence. And particularly with your younger audiences, if you are looking to show up in front of them, it's no longer just, I have a website or that you have your ads showing up on Google. You have to actually be in the places where they're interacting. Those are places like TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook Reels and Google Business, the Google My Business map section. Like all those things, in order to show up on them, they all require content. And getting into them it can take a lot of effort if you are trying to create content for everything. And so, what we talk about with Strategic Influence Podcast is how can you use one single leverage point, like a video podcast, to create the content for everything and use it as an omnipresence tool.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think the other thing, like you're talking about the audience, I think the other thing is that I've done a lot of freelancing in the course of my life. One of the things that really threw my freelancing over the top was when I started creating free educational content for YouTube in a very podcasty way, even though at that point they weren't really probably going to ever call it a podcast. But so I did just video instruction for marketing softwares and WordPress. And I think one of the things that happens when you create that content and you can leverage it in that way is that you also show people you actually know what you're talking about. So it gives them a job interview for you before they ever become a customer. And so they already trust that you actually know what you're saying. Because in the world we have now, especially with how technical everything's gotten, it's really hard to know if the guy you're trying to hire, especially freelancers, actually are going to do a good job for you. And I think that's what the other benefit to this kind of thing is, like the real strategies and the fact that you're proving you can do what you say you're going to do for people. And
Oh,
that's
it,
to be able to leverage that over and over again is powerful. You don't have to make 4,000 cold calls to let somebody know.
yeah, it's a value in advance play. There's a lot of things that are happening with the Strategic Influence podcast, and we can talk about all of them. But the thing that I want to get across is the strategic influence is not just I have a podcast and it's on Apple Podcasts. It's I have a podcast that's creating helpful, unique, value in advance style content that's being put and cut up and used on every major network and showing up where your audience is or where your potential customers are. Especially your younger generations, your millennial and your Gen Z, they do this thing that I have started terming a heartbeat check on businesses. If you're going to call a plumber or you're going to call a lawyer, they're going to go on to whatever their social media platform of choice is. Let's say it's Facebook, and they're going to check your Facebook page and they're going to go through and look at the top number of plumbers. And it doesn't matter how good your ad is on Google, they're going to check your Facebook page. If you haven't posted in 2 years, as far as they're concerned, you're a dead business, right? There's no heartbeat.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really poignant because I've noticed that too, and I for sure do that.
Mhm.
I've never thought about it quite now, those terms.
Yeah, I said I've started calling it a heartbeat check because really that's what it is. And you notice that you start doing it, the younger generation, that's the baseline. That's where they start. Whereas like people like me who are Gen X or in the next older generation, I can't remember what it is, baby boomer generation, we might start with looking at the ads or looking at who's in the directory or whatever, and then we might go and check on social media. But the younger generation, they start with social media and they start with that heartbeat check and they look for the businesses that have a heartbeat. And the heartbeat is, are they regularly posting content that is useful? And so I think the difference is we've had this shift. Everyone's talking about we were in the information age. And I think the information age is over. And we're in a new age. I've started calling it the trust age, where you have to establish trust before someone will do business with you. And one of the best ways to create that trust is with that content, that value in advance, and showing up in the places where they're already acting. So that's the purpose of a strategic influence podcast is you can build that trust and you can show up where they are. And that's really what that means.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think that's exactly true. Like I said, I think the trust thing, and that's where I was going with being able to leverage that fact you can prove. Like value in advance is words that I think I hear people say value lots, and I don't always know that it means anything again, because it's like just an all encompassing word, it seems sometimes when it comes to this stuff. But the truth is that proof that I've actually delivered something to you ahead of time and you can see that it works and I'm telling you the truth has become so paramount in a modern age when people can fake it much better than they ever used to.
Yeah.
Like
And
it's kind
they have
of
access to
crazy.
they have access to all the world's information. So they have access to all the world's businesses. And with the borders going away with because of the internet, like you have to show up and you actually have to have that trust and that influence.
Yeah.
And just because 20 years ago you dominated with the yellow pages or the last 10 years you dominated on radio or TV, it doesn't mean that today your business is going to dominate unless you figure out how to show up and create that trust and create the content and the personal brand that goes along with it. And so,
Truthfully, I do reviews before I do, like you said, if I was looking for a plumber, where would I end up going? I'd go looking for reviews before I did anything. And then I would go check to see if they were actually a living, breathing creature that,
yeah,
because if the second thing is I don't actually believe any of the reviews either, because so many companies have gotten caught paying people to say they got something great before they actually have something great.
your business is the same way on the business side where if you have ever tried to get reviews, you'll know like places like I'm not going to name names because I don't want to get myself in trouble, but there are places that collect reviews that will hold the good reviews hostage if you don't pay them and only show the bad reviews. When you're the person that is showing up regularly in their feed talking about your business, talking about plumbing or talking about whatever, it's like my wife follows this lady on TikTok that does repair for dishwashers and such. And just every time
Oh,
she's out, she's
nice.
repairing dishwashers, my wife watches her. And so anytime if we ever needed a dishwasher fixed and that person was in our local area, she would call her immediately, right? Like that would be the only person she would
In
need.
my yeah, that's hilarious because that's awesome. In my early 20s, I used to be the guy who repaired appliances all the time, and I used to use YouTube for it. Like I would go on Kijiji, post an ad saying we'll repair appliances for X number, and that's how I made spare cash in my early 20s.
That's funny. Yeah.
So
So, but nowadays that's like the default is people who are looking to do business with businesses. They're looking for the ones who are willing to talk about the work that they do and educate the populace. Because if you have a choice between two different businesses and one of them just has ads and the other one has a bunch of free content that's educational and empowering and funny and entertaining and any of those kind of things, like who's going to get the business?
you know what? Let's just say because I absolutely, if I was going to hire a contractor and I knew there was a contractor who was showing me, like, here's what the bylaws say for permitting here in your region. Now I'm going to show you how to do it yourself. I'd probably hire him, not because he didn't show me how to do it, but because I'm like, oh, he knows how to do it. He showed me that he knows how to look up the laws regarding it. He knows it requires a permit. I'm a heck of a long ways further ahead by choosing him over just trying to choose somebody who says we're great on the radio or says we're
We're
great
we're
on some
bonded, we're
Facebook.
insured, we've got all the things, call us. What's interesting about all of that is we talk about this strategic influence as being essential nowadays, but on the same level, it doesn't mean you stop doing direct response ads, but it does make those direct response ads more potent. So, like, one of the examples that I give for our clients is when you go through the process, go through the buyer's journey, in this case, hire a contractor, you start looking at all these things, you start getting to the point where you want to build something, you start doing research and you start looking at stuff and you start like doing things and Google starts to notice that you're looking at contractor stuff, so they start showing the local contractor who's putting up his YouTube videos in front of your feed all the time, right? And you start seeing this guy pop up and he's showing up there, he's showing up regularly. Let's say we go 6 months down the line, you never even watched maybe one of his videos, but you just saw him in your feed all the time, just saw his face, you can see the titles on the videos, it's here's how to permit, here's how to do whatever. You don't even have to watch them, just the fact that he's there all the time. When you finally get to the point where you're like, okay, I need to hire someone, and you go over to Google and you type in the contractor and you see the ads that show up. And it's like person number one, person number two, and like say the third person, it's his face and his name. You're like, oh, I know that guy. That's the guy from TikTok, right? That's the guy from YouTube. Who are you clicking on?
I'm not sure where I recognize him from
Yeah.
because you saw him in your Facebook feed and you saw him in your YouTube feed. You
Yeah.
didn't even consciously actually notice him until that moment when you're like, oh, I recognize that guy's face. He
Yeah.
must be important. We also
Same.
assign importance sometimes just to familiarity.
Yeah. What's crazy to me is I have our podcast, which is called The Hero Show, and we're 220 episodes into that. So I've been doing it for years and we show up all over the place. And I'll have new people that'll come on that show or people that have seen that show and they'll be like, "Oh, you're famous. You're the guy who runs the Hero Show." And I'm like, it cracks me up because we're not like Joe Rogan famous.
You don't feel famous.
Feel famous. And they're all excited to talk to me because they're like, you have this clout that comes with being a content creator. So there's a lot of benefits to that for businesses. And so when we're talking about what is strategic influence, is that you have a relationship that you've built over time because of the content that you're putting out.
Are you ready to amplify your influence and stand out from the noise? Join Richard Matthews on pbp.fm as he explores the power of podcasting, social media, and strategic content to boost your reach. You'll discover the latest trends in video, audio, and influencer marketing, plus unlock insider tips to create binge-worthy content spotlighting you as a leader. With upbeat energy and clear, empowering advice, Richard guides publishers, experts, and entrepreneurs on starting a podcast, improving social strategy, and connecting with your perfect audience. Visit pbp.fm and book a podcast strategy session to start spreading your message today.
So one last thing I want to get into for this episode, because we're going to get into over this course, these episodes, is how to actually build all of this, what you need to do with it, is I want to talk a little about, there's 3 different leverage points that you get from a strategic influence podcast. We've talked a little bit about some of these now, but I want to touch on them really specifically. And the first one is time leverage. And when people are talking about creating content, like in your head, you're thinking, wait, I have to create YouTube videos and I have to create TikTok videos and I have to create Facebook Reels and Instagram Reels and posts on Twitter and posts on LinkedIn and posts for Google My Business. And you're talking about doing a podcast and all these things. Like, what does it sound like, right?
Sounds like a ton of work.
It sounds like a ton of work, right? It sounds like, how am I ever going to, like, I'm a contractor, I'm a lawyer, I run an agency, I do actual business, I run a restaurant, whatever it is. You have shit to do.
I
Creating
think
content
that's
with
what
all
makes
these
the
places.
idea of it being a second business sound so scary, because you're like, I already run one business and that's lots of work.
Yeah, that's lots of work. So on the one hand, and a lot of businesses are thinking, I need to be in this content game, because you can see it. If you're watching this episode, if you're watching other businesses doing content and you see the benefit they get from it, I need to be in playing this game. So the question is, how do you play this game without starting a whole nother business that's in the content creation space? That's where we have this disconnect. And that's where I want to talk about the time leverage that comes from doing
I've fought those exact feelings, honestly, like, because a lot of the people that I've listened to for years now are like, you're a media company. Like, but I don't know anything about being a media company.
Yeah. You hear that all the time now. It doesn't matter. Like Ryan Dice from digitalmarketer.com says, it doesn't matter what business you're in. The business you're in is the attention business. And Gary Vee, he's like, put content up everywhere. Be a demonstrator. Demonstrate what you do. And so, like,
Yeah.
the highest paid businesses nowadays are the ones that are demonstrating their work in the public. They work out loud.
Yeah. Well, even look at Alex Formosi. He does I tweet all my video ideas.
So the reality is, you have to be in this game if you want to continue to grow and dominate in whatever business you're in today, right? Depending on your industry, might be further behind than others. It doesn't matter. Like, your construction is going to be a long ways out before it's de facto standard. But if you start doing it today in the construction space, you'll crush it,
Yeah,
right?
you'll force everybody else to
You'll
follow
force
you.
everyone else to follow you. So depending on your industry, you might have a much larger set of results from it sooner. But if you're in the digital agency space, everyone's doing it. You'll have to try harder to stand out. So depending on your industry, it might be a little bit more difficult, but you have to do this at some point. That's just the future, right? When everyone had the internet, I remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago now, maybe it's even longer than that. It's almost 20 years ago, like 2005. So almost 20 years
Wow.
ago, you have to have a mobile website, right? As smartphones are starting to take over, eventually your site is accessible on a mobile device now. Because if it's not, nobody's going to do business with you. This is the same kind of thing. And we're at the beginning of that phase. So the time leverage is where, specifically, what we mean when we say strategic influence podcast is, we need to create something that allows you to do all of that work without taking over your business. And so we talk about a multimedia podcast as a really high leverage point, because you can take one episode like this one, it's 20 to 30 minutes long, talking about a specific content piece for your business. And then you can take that piece of content and you can do a video edit it for it. You put in an intro and an outro and a commercial, some lower thirds on it. Now you have a YouTube video. And you can strip the audio out of it and put in a audio intro and outro on it. And you have a podcast that goes onto the podcast networks. You can take poignant things that we have said, right, through the thing, and you can turn those into the TikTok shorts. And you can take quotes that, like, you or I have said on the thing, and turn those into Instagram posts. And if you have a process for that, you can take 1 2-hour recording session where you record 2 or 3 episodes and have an entire month's worth of content in your business.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely prolific.
you can be prolific. You can create omnipresence without a humongous amount of time input. So what we're going to do over the course of these several episodes is teach you the processes that need to happen afterwards and teach you what it takes to actually put together a couple of recording sessions and do all of that, because it doesn't have to be something that takes over your whole business. So that's the first leverage point, is time leverage. The second one is access leverage. And access leverage is actually my favorite. And so what access leverage is this idea that if you have a podcast, you can get anyone anywhere to say yes to you. They're the easiest yeses you'll ever get, where you say, hey, I would like to get you to come on my podcast and talk to you. So the reason why this is important, especially for a lot of businesses, is the content game is not a start content today, get business tomorrow kind of game. It's not like direct response ads where like I put up a Google ad today and I pay for it and someone clicks on it, they become a lead. I have a thing, right? That's direct response. This is content marketing. You're creating that trust and awareness over the course of time. You're going to be filling up your pipeline for 6 months down the road, a year down the road, 2 years down the road with the content you're putting out today. And a lot of businesses need to like, how do I shorten the time to turning that into value for my company? And so one of the ways that you can do that is with this access leverage. I recommend most of our clients that you have between 50 and 75% of your content is you sharing your expert stuff. And the other 25 to 50% is you inviting guests on, either from your local community or from the businesses in town, to do interviews. And you can do a couple of things with those. And it's high value prospecting or high value referral partnerships. And you can use your podcast as a way to hack and build relationships. So imagine you are a chiropractor in town and you can interview or invite on all of the massage therapists in town and all of the physical therapists in town and all of the other people who might be related, who are serving clients that you would also serve. And you can build relationships with all of them. And you can build an incredible referral network very quickly, because they'll all say yes to you coming on your show and then you promoting their business for them. Right? That's high value referral
Yeah,
partner.
I've never thought of it as access leverage, but I love that. I love that so much, that capacity to network, especially locally. One of the interesting things too is like people are fairly famous. If you create, or if you ask good questions or have good conversations and they can see you've done it consistently, some of those people who you never think would come see you will actually come join you on your podcast. It's crazy.
Yeah. I've gotten on my podcast, I've had people that, like QVC sellers that sell $500,000 a year of jewelry come onto my podcast. I had billion-dollar tech startups come onto my podcast, and because they're like, "Oh, I see you do this consistently. You're here all the time." So that there's more benefits than just the access, right? Because I build the relationships with those people, and if you're intentional about like, "Hey, I want to have you on the show, and I want to promote you and promote your business and do those things," you get their story, provide benefit to them, and you create reciprocity. And so then they start sharing your podcast to their audience. And then if you actually build a referral relationship, you can get them to send you customers as well. So it can very quickly go from I'm creating content, but I'm also creating referrals into my business. Right. So that's one thing. And then the other one is high value prospecting. Right. So one of the things we do with the Hero Show is we'll reach out to businesses that we specifically want to work with at Push Button Podcast and invite them onto our show, where we will tell their story and talk about who they are and talk about their business. And we do all those things. Part of that process, because we're getting their story, is we find out, because they're telling us their story, what their problems are and what they're looking at. So now we can actually have the sales conversations with them later on down the line. We built the first $250,000 worth of revenue a year in our business just off of that one thing alone, which is interviewing guests on our podcast. And so high value referrals, high value prospecting is a way that you can turn the effort that you're going to have to do anyways into earlier revenue in your business. And so that's the second
I
form of
love
leverage.
that so much because I never thought about the number of times that what I was doing as much as anything is just saying, "Hey, what are your problems?" Or I recognize your problems when you talk to somebody
Mhm.
in that way, and how much interviews do that all the time. That's cool. That's very cool.
Yeah, a very interesting way to build an intentional way to meet the prospects that you want and to build the referral partnerships that you want, which you should be doing those things in your business anyway. So when we're talking about what is a strategic influence podcast, it's one of the highest leverage activities you can do, because you can leverage your time for the content. You can leverage that same time to build referral partnerships. You can leverage that same time to build high value prospecting. And that's just like, those are just three types of leverage. We got another
Yeah,
one
and
to go
over the
over.
long arc, you also end up having that same conversation essentially with other people in the same industry or with the same business growth problem without ever actually meeting them, where they're just having the one-way conversation consuming your content.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is you have a tremendous amount of benefits that come from doing this work. So if you're doing it intentionally, which is what we want to teach people, is how can you take something that doesn't have to take a lot of your time, that can hit a lot of parts in your business, right? Because you can have it be part of your cold outreach method where you're reaching those people that you wanted to have on your show anyways. You can build, we call it halo marketing, when if you invite business A onto your show and you build them up and talk to them and you get their things, they might end up being a client of yours. They might end up being a referral of yours. And they'll almost guaranteed take their episode that you built and produced and made look nice for them and share it with their whole audience. So you get the leverage of their audience as well. They're putting you in front of all of their people. So there's just so many benefits that come from doing that. That's why we recommend almost all of our clients, you should have a mix of your content of here's me and my content and my expertise in my business. And also here's the other businesses that are going to be helpful to my audience, the other people that are going to be helpful to my audience. So you can bring them in and you can use those again for those referrals and for those high value prospecting. So that's the second form of leverage, is access leverage. And the third one is what I call buyer's journey leverage. And buyer's journey leverage is, I said, it's not my favorite. Access is my favorite, but the buyer's journey is probably the most powerful. And so what that means is, are you familiar with Eugene Schwartz buyer's journey?
I am very familiar. And I
Yeah.
do essentially, when you talk about marketing automation, which I've done for 6 years, almost exclusively as a freelancer and consultant, my entire job is to create a buyer's journey and make the buyer's journey change to fit the customer's needs,
Yeah, exactly.
target needs.
So for those of you who don't know, Eugene Schwartz created this term buyer's journey, and it's this idea that you have people are mostly unaware of their problems. And then something happens where they become aware of their problems. And then once they become aware of their problems, then they start looking for solutions. And then eventually they become solutions aware. And then they get to this point where they're very aware because they're actually they're looking at specific people who have solutions to those problems. And then they actually buy. And that's where they choose someone to do business with. And so what happens is you have the most amount of people over here and unaware. Right. And then as you move closer and closer to the buyer, like the other end of the buyer's journey, they're going to choose one person to do business with. And so the fewer number of people are on this side over at the buyer's journey. Direct response marketing, which is what most people are familiar with, is I have an ad and I put an ad in front of people and then they take action on that and they become a client or a customer, right? That's what a direct response ad is. Those ads are almost always 99.9% of the time, they're directed towards people who are at the end of their buyer's journey, right? Where they're going to Google or they're going to, in the old days, they're going to Yellow Pages, flipping through who's the lawyer I'm going to call, right? They're looking to respond directly to an ad to say, I need to do something. I need to take care of this problem. So there's a couple of things to that. One, you should absolutely be doing that, because if you're not, you're going to get destroyed by your customers, your competitors who are. But you're talking to the smallest group of people possible about your business. And what buyer's journey leverage is how can we start talking to the much larger groups of people further back in that journey and help them along the journey. So when they get to the point where they're ready to make a buyer's decision, when they're presented with all the options of who they could do business with, that they have a relationship with one of those people. And that person would be you, right? Because you've put the content in there for them and you've actually helped them through this. So one of the ways I like to describe this, I use I think it's called a metaphor called the crocodile infested river. So if you think of the world and rivers in the middle, one side is where your buyers are and the other side is them having their problem solved, right? We talk about the construction thing again. They got their house built, they're living in it. That's the promised land. The actual crocodile infested river is I've hired someone to work on my property and we're going to build the house. That's the river. And we've got all the problems and everything to go along with that. But before that, before they get to the river, they have this journey they go through. They're like, I think maybe I'm going to hire a contractor and build a guest house on my property. And so they're going to start looking and researching things and they're going to how do I solve this? Who are the right kinds of things? There's all sorts of stuff that's going to happen before they make a decision. And that buyer's journey is where most businesses don't have any marketing happening there, right? They don't do any marketing until someone's going, I need to hire a contractor. And they go to Google contractor in XYZ city. And then they just pick a business and go. Now, what the buyer's journey leverages is all this content that we've created is showing up in all their feeds. And we mentioned this before, right? They're going to start seeing their face on TikTok, seeing their face on Facebook, seeing them all over the place where they're like, oh, there's one of the things that I'm looking at. This guy knows what he's talking about. You start seeing that content and you're helping someone through the buyer's journey. So when they get to the point that they're ready to make a buying decision and they go and they see all the people who are sitting along the edge of the river saying, hey, I can help you build a house. I can help you build a house. And then there's Kevin Rundle, who's there, who's got his solution to help you build the house, but you got a relationship with Kevin. you know who Kevin is. You've seen his work. You've seen him talk through all these things. Even if you haven't watched all this stuff, you've seen him scroll past your feed every other day. And all the other people, they might as well just be blank faces, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you probably saw him come up for 15 seconds on the next autoplay at some point, at least. But I think that's 100% true. The other thing is like, there's very few ways to hold somebody into a journey where you actually get to be potentially the first person to give them awareness.
So that's
Um,
the third piece is that of leverage is the buyer's journey leverage. And my favorite part about that is it's not creating today's leads and it's not creating tomorrow's leads, but it's creating your leads for 6 months and it's creating your leads 2 years from now. And if you are doing this now, you can get to the point where you're creating such a windfall of people who are going to know you and like you and trust you that you can really grow your business a lot with that over the course of time. And it only gets more powerful the longer you do it. And so you get time leverage, which is great for you. You get the early benefits of the access leverage, and you get the long-term benefits of the buyer's journey leverage. And that's really what we mean when we talk about a strategic influence podcast and why you might want to have one.
Yeah, I think that is the reason you basically need one as a business in 2023. And maybe things will change. Maybe they'll invent Holodex next week and everybody will be scrambling to something new. But we're never going backwards.
But for now, it's definitely something that if you're in business, you should be considering this. Now, we've already gotten 45 minutes talking about all this, but the next couple of things we're going to talk about in this series is how you actually put all these pieces together. So we're going to talk about how you build a strategic influence podcast. We're going to talk about some things like how to build a mini studio, right? So you can see mine. I've got a couple of lights, a little microphone that you can see, and backdrop. We're going to show you how to build a mini studio. And maybe you'll even be lucky. We'll show you how Kevin's going to set his up, and you'll see it get better over the next couple of weeks with his. We're going to talk about knowing what to say, right? One of the things that if you've done this before, people are like, oh, I don't know what to say in a podcast. How do I say things? So we're going to talk about how you do content planning. We're going to talk a little bit about how to do content outlining so you can have topics you want for your podcast, what to actually say after you hit start record. We're going to talk a little bit about the assets you need to build. So things like you got to have a cover graphic that goes on iTunes, and you got to build like your intro and your outros for YouTube. We'll show you how to build those and what those look like. And then we'll talk about like where to record. Kevin and I are recording in an app called Squadcast. What state are you in right now, Kevin?
I'm actually in Canada. I'm in Alberta, Canada. So
we're in two different countries, right? I'm in Florida, you're in Alberta, Canada. And yet we can have really high quality recordings. We can show you how to do that, what apps you need to make that happen. Then we're going to show you what to do after you hit the stop record button, right? Because now you have something recorded, you need to do the work with it. So we'll show you what those steps are and then how you promote it and how you run all this and build the systems in your business. So that's what we're going to be doing over the course of these episodes. Do you have any other thoughts for our people who are listening and following along with this series?
So we are in the midst of also building some stuff for you guys to download. And as soon as it's available, it will be for sure in the show notes and anywhere we post, so that you guys can find that stuff to help you figure out if you're following along the way we expect. I think there's going to be some great stuff, and I really hope to see a lot of great podcasts come out of this that just blow our minds and we turn into big fans of. So
yeah, so this will be everywhere on all of our podcast stuff, our groups, where we can post this content. We're drinking our own Kool-Aid and showing you exactly what a strategic influence podcast can do for your business by doing it ourselves. So thank you for joining us on this episode, Kevin. Thanks for coming on and having this conversation with me. Look forward to building this whole series together. I think it's going to be really valuable for people.
I think so too, Richard. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to continue to creating these podcasts for a long time to come. And I'm excited to pull the camera outwards a little bit and start working on my own podcast and share all that with our audience also.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this episode then. Thanks for joining us this week on pbp.fm. Make sure to visit our website, pbp.fm, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or via RSS so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating on Apple Podcasts. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. And if you'd like to get help building an omnipresent content marketing strategy with a podcast and you want help, you might want to book a podcast strategy session with us at pbp.fm. Just click the Book a Strategy Session button and book a time on our calendar. We look forward to speaking with you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.